Welcome, everybody. This is Kirsten Leekman, and I'm your host today for the Audacious Authenticity Summit. In this symposium, we explore principles of success through the lens of authenticity. And as the symposium has evolved, we've brought in so many different domains that are so fascinating to look at. We're looking not only at the domains of selling and marketing and self-branding, but also self-publishing and public speaking communications, as well as the realm of psychology, and looking at how we can remove the barriers to our authentic self. And so that is today's lens, is the lens of psychology. And so I am so thrilled to have with us today Dr. Helene Brenner, who is a psychologist, and she's the author of the book, I Know I'm in There Somewhere, A Woman's Guide to Finding Her Inner Voice and Living a Life of Authenticity. And I have to tell you all, Helene was one of my first conversations that I had, and it really helped inspire me to go forward and to really understand there is something incredibly juicy about this conversation about authenticity and what it means to show up authentic in life and in business. So I'm so thrilled that you're with us, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Kirsten, and I'm just very excited about being with you today, and I just love this theme of authenticity, and I think it's such an important theme for today, and in the case of who I specialize with, particularly women in today's society.
Fabulous. So I'd like you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself. Just give them a little bit of a background and how you came to this moment in time where you were inspired to write that book and work with women and this notion of authenticity. So just give them a little background on yourself.
Well, I have been in practice for about 25 years. In practicing psychology with people from all walks of life, adults. And I didn't set out to write a book initially, but as I was working with folks, and particularly with women, I really felt that I wanted to reinforce the whole idea of how to come from your authentic self. A lot of people all the time, they're hearing you should love yourself, you should listen to your heart, you should be authentic, but nobody really, there's no instruction book on how to do that. And the funny thing is, especially when I wrote this book in 2003 in particular, there was just so much emphasis on positive thinking, on kind of put on a happy face and fake it till you make it, and just push through. And I felt that people really needed a model of how to come from their authentic self that was real and true and honored all their feelings. And I call my book, I call a self-acceptance book rather than a self-improvement book, because I think we're getting those messages all the time and having such high expectations about improving ourselves, being pulled in so many directions, trying to be perfect, trying to work harder and harder to live up to everyone's expectations. And then when you can't do it, really blaming yourself. And that does not make for an authentic lifestyle, does it? No.
Definitely not.
So I really come from a place of what's right with us and how do we listen to our hearts? How do we do that? And particularly for women, one of the difficult things is that, and one of the most wonderful things is that connection is extremely important to most of us. Mm-hmm. Our own voice is really important, and really hearing the heartbeat, the spirit of ourselves, and at the same time, really also respond to others and intimate relationships and relationships with children and friends. And to make it even harder, women have a legacy that's passed down from generation to generation that tells them to mold and accommodate to others at the expense of themselves. Mm-hmm. So we have all those voices, and I call that the voices we hear from others as outside voices. They aren't necessarily our inner voice, but they're very, very loud. And in fact, they're often way louder than our inner voice. And so people will say to me, well, how can I stop caring about what other people think? Can you just cut that part out of me? And unfortunately, I really can't, because it's our biology and it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to care about others. And in fact, it's probably the reason we as a human race are still, human beings are still here, is that we do care for others, and that it's imperative, and we listen, we know about others' needs, and we might wake up in the middle of the night to take care of a child, or we might feel like, wow, that friend needs me, and give them a call. What I find is really important, and the key to it all about listening to yourself, is to raise the volume of your inner self rather than trying to cut those other things out. It's like that greater than sign we learned about in school, like make our own voice louder than everybody else's, and learn how to hear what our heart is telling us, what our inner knowing is telling us, what our feelings are telling us, what that sixth sense that we have is telling us, and really beginning to also pay attention to that, what our wanting is telling us, what our deep wanting, is such a huge key to listening to your inner voice and being authentic.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And there was so much juicy stuff. I want to go in so many different directions with that. But one of the things that caught my attention that was really kind of fascinating is you said, we want to care about people. But isn't there a distinction between caring about and caring what other people think? Don't you see, isn't there a distinction there? And would you go into that a little bit?
I hear you there, Kirsten, and that is really true. However, I think what happens for women and many sensitive men too is we don't realize it. Like, we don't set out to say, and women, they don't set out to say, I'm going to lose myself in a relationship. But what happens is that we tend to be very permeable in a good way. Like, that openness is also that openness to our own feelings, and to be able to hear ourselves, to be really open. And what happens is that without even knowing it sometimes, and this is the really tricky thing here, without even knowing it, we can become permeable to what other people, it's like that thing that happens when people say, where do you want to go? Well, where do you want to go? And then the person says, anywhere's okay. But this place is nice, but any place is okay. But you get that sense inside, oh, but they really want to go there, right? Because you're being open. Right. And that's just a simple example. It's totally harmless, right? But what happens is, hearing it so much, it tends to color and influence you. TV knows this because of, think about advertising, that sort of subtle brainwashing, and then you think you want something that you didn't even really want. But it's very subtle because we're so open. And that's where it's like, oh, I'm hearing it. If you're not hearing it, and you're mostly hearing yourself, you don't think about it so much. But if you're hearing it, it's sometimes difficult for it not to color your perception or what you think you wanted. I'll give you an example. I had a woman I was seeing, call her Charlotte, and she decided, wow, she had 2 kids and she was also working, and she decided she really wanted to go to this awesome conference. And she mentioned it to her husband, and he said, well, are you sure that, what if something happened to you on the way? Like, get an accident, you got those 2 kids and they really depend on you, right? And sounds a little like, it wasn't like, but he said, but if you want to go, sure, right? So I call that the reluctant green light. He didn't give her the green light and say, "You go, that's great. I think that's awesome. I'm so excited that, you're getting away and doing this thing to enrich yourself." He kind of, what I call, gave her the reluctant green light. But she picked up on it and she said, "Well, maybe, gosh, maybe I really shouldn't go. Maybe what if something happened to me? Or maybe I'm not really wanting to go." And then she realized in working with me that all her life she'd gotten the reluctant green light. Like if there was cake, she'd give the cake to someone else first before she took her piece. But you see how subtle that is? I mean, yeah, and maybe it doesn't sound subtle. So, but it can be. And so what I find is that it's not as if women are saying, "Hey, I'm a doormat. I'm not, I'm going to give you what you want." Most people, and I mean, there are people like that are truly in very codependent relationships, but for the most part, it's really that we're so open and we're so sensitive. And then we devalue that sensitivity. Like people will say, "Oh, you're too sensitive." I got that, for example, growing up, right? You're nodding your head like you've heard that one. Or why do you care so much about what other people think? But we also get messages, "You've got a mind of your own." And I say, "Well, whose mind would you want me to have?" Right? So we get those messages. But truly, sensitivity is a gift. I mean, wouldn't you rather have a really expensive camera that was so sensitive or an electron microscope than a 79-cent compass? So we're put down about that sensitivity when it's an incredibly exquisite instrument, satellite dish within ourselves. That's because most of the time the people that we know, they benefit from that sensitivity. But when it bothers them, they say, "Oh, you're too sensitive." But the truth is, it's not the sensitivity, it's learning how to use that instrument so that you can hear other people's feelings, but you hear yours as well, that you hear other people's opinions, but it doesn't blank out yours, that you could still hear yours, that you might really want other people's input because it's so much fun to say, "Hey, what do you think?" or to get support. But if you don't get that support, not to sell yourself down the river, to have the ability to sit back and say, "What do I want? What do I need?"
Isn't it important to have that actually be the first step in any relationship and set that grounding foundation, but then learn to weave with other people in the beautiful dance we call life or relationship, but have the grounding foundation first?
Well, yes. Yes, I do think that that if you have that, and certainly people, for example, when we're young, if it's mirrored, like I try to, for example, really listen to what is the inner voice of my daughters. What is the spark? What is that thing that really is so them? And I do think that I was fortunate, for example, to have a dad who recognized and said, "I want you to do whatever you want to do." A lot of people don't get that. And what a lot of people get is, "It's my need for you to be home with me. And so I'm going to say, well, or I'm afraid something might happen to you, so don't take a walk in the park with your friend. Or I would rather have you home, so don't go to school far away." Unfortunately, and sometimes it's really subtle. But the relationship is important. I think that, yes, it's important, but I don't think it's realistic from having worked with people for so long to say, "Go off by yourself and have your own vision quest and figure it out for you and then be in relationships." Unfortunately, relationships are part of us. So I think we need to do both. I think we can be in relationship, and it can even be an impetus to say, to recognize how important it is to learn to hear yourself. I don't think we have to throw them out. I don't think we can really turn back the clock, because we have these relationships in our life. However, I do think I have this phrase that says to really think about this if you are in a relationship, is to say, particularly with a significant other, is to say, do I like the me that I am with that person? If you don't, then it's really important to begin to be the self you like, and to see if that person can handle the heat, right? If they can't, it's probably, not going to work out. But don't second guess. Be yourself. A lot of times people are themselves, and they, that was the person that, that person fell in love with that spunky person. And then they think, well, I'm in a relationship now, so I better put that person first. And they start subtly changing it. But keeping that question foremost, do I like the me I am? I want to be the me I like. And, and does that person, are they able to bring that out in me? And if I am that way, can they stand it? Like Charlotte, for example, started to be the her she liked, started to be the person that said, hey, I'm going to go somewhere and, have a night out with my friends, or go to a conference, and I'm going to start doing the work I want to do. And I'm going to start speaking up to you. And you know what? It worked out.
Nice.
He had to mold to her, right? He had to get bigger. She got bigger. So she didn't have to leave, but she had to separate from that image that she had to be what she thought he wanted. And she had to start taking special care to listen to yourself. So there are ways you can do that to hear yourself more. So I don't know if does that answer your question?
Yeah. And you just said there's ways to do that. So why don't you speak to that? I mean, you speak to women, especially having challenges with finding their authentic voice because of, the training, if you will, that they've gotten. And so what practices can they do? What can they do about this?
Right. Well, first thing is very important is not to compare yourself with other people. I use this metaphor of a plant tag. You know how plants have a plant tag when you go to the store, you buy a plant to tell you what will help them thrive, what will help them grow the best, not just survive, but really thrive. And I say, pay attention. Why shouldn't we have a plant tag that says, what do we need? And it's different for each person. And we wouldn't tell an African violet to be like a daisy and have those needs. But we often will say that to ourselves. Why do we need it? So-and-so doesn't need it, or they're like this. Well, we need to think about what would be on our plant tag. What helps us thrive, and really pay attention to that. Because when we're more resourced, when we really are taking care of our needs and taking really full care, not just like to survive, but to thrive, listening and knowing and getting in touch with what we need to thrive, we will be stronger out there to withstand. If somebody then says, why don't you do it this way? And you're like, nah, this is what works for me. It'll start coming out of you. You don't have to try to be that. What you do need to do is listen to what you need, turn up the volume, hear what you need, and nourish that. Another thing you can do is if you start feeling like you're being influenced by what other people tell you, and you're sitting here and you're going, what should I do? But, I don't know. Well, imagine putting all of those people out of the room, or even as far as the other side of the world. Here in the U.S., so I might say, oh, well, what if they're in Australia, and then tune in. Now, okay, what do I want? What do I truly want? That could really help. Like if so-and-so were completely out of the equation, what would I want? That's one thing you can do to help you go, no, if they weren't a factor at all, what would I want to do?
What do they do with the fears that come up around suddenly having, quote unquote, sent them away and being, quote unquote, alone? I'm sure that brings up a lot of triggers as well. Is there anything that you recommend they do as almost that first step before they get to what do I want?
Right. Well, one of the things is recognizing those voices that aren't your inner voice, but are the other people. So sometimes you can make a list, like what is coming from me and what am I hearing from other people. Sometimes that is really helpful.
How do they do that? How, I mean, somebody
Say,
who's been enmeshed, yeah.
like for example, your mother's voices. What were all the things your mother told you? You know, and then like, what do you want to keep? What do you not want to keep? What are things other people are telling you? Another thing is to have a lot of compassion. I'm so big on compassion, and people think compassion isn't feeling sorry for yourself. Compassion is work. Compassion is the effort. Let me really have compassion for how I might really feel that way, and to really understand how it is to be me, to really feel because it is important for people to need support, and I'm really, we need support in our lives, and we need other people, and to have compassion. Though, wow, maybe something triggered you. Like the thing that triggers people the most is often shame. When they feel like they're bad for feeling a certain way. Shame is very powerful. So sometimes I would say, if you start to feel bad, did something happen where you felt ashamed? Did you feel like, like for example, in that Charlotte story where you said, well, something could happen to you, or did somebody say something that made you feel bad? And to give compassion to that part inside that felt ashamed, to realize that shame would be the biggest thing in the way often of doing what you want. Or a lot of times people, when I talked about outside voices, they got criticized or shamed for wanting what they want. They were told they wanted too much. They were told, that's too expensive, or you shouldn't want that much, or you're being too demanding. And the truth is, what I tell people is often it's the opposite. They really didn't allow themselves to want enough. And that's why they got out of touch with it. Because wanting, again, when I talked about that greater sign, if you raise the volume of your wanting so that wanting is greater than fear, it's going to propel you. We're never going to completely get out of fearing necessarily. Most people, there are a few people that, they're skydiving, they're like fearless completely. But most of us, it's because, I'll tell you why. We have two brains. We have that higher brain that wants us to self-actualize. That's what we're talking about today, that authenticity, that reaching higher levels. But we also have within us that animal brain. There's a lot of research now in neurobiology. But we have that place that says, above all, stay secure. And that is actually so that we will survive. We have the instinct to survive. And our animal brain says, why take a risk when what you've done so far has kept you alive? You haven't died. It cares about us surviving and reproducing. So, suddenly people go, what happened? How come I wanted that so much, to write that book or to change careers or to move across the country? And all of a sudden I'm saying, what? What was I thinking? That's the worst idea ever. And they feel hijacked. It's because something took over and said, uh-oh, you're not